Okay, folks, my last video was about answering the question, if human beings are descended from apes, then why are there still apes? And I got a really good reply on YouTube to that video. And it was talking mainly about my portrayal of intelligent design, because the intelligent design argument to me is a matter mostly of probabilities. But this person who replied to me also brought up the fact that one of the hallmarks of intelligent design is irreducible complexity. And irreducible complexity means that once you get down to a certain granularity of looking at biological systems, it looks like those biological systems could not have possibly evolved from anything simpler than themselves. So the question becomes, it's like, okay, if you didn't have some sort of intelligence putting these things together, then how did you get this system that seems too irreducibly complex to have spontaneously evolved? Um, Now, I'm glad that that subject was brought up, but in the context of Herschel Walker's argument about why are there still apes if human beings descended from apes, it's really apples and oranges. It doesn't really matter about the irreducible complexity part, because what Herschel Walker is talking about is common descent. Common descent and irreducible complexity are two entirely different subjects, and you can speak about them separately. Common descent just basically means that if you look at all living beings on this planet, you can basically trace their lineages up a tree all the way back to three or four, maybe quintessential life forms like single celled organisms, some prokaryotes, eukaryotes, some kinds of fungi. There's really only three or four different kinds of life on Earth, and everything is descended from those three or four common ancestor life forms, and they have since developed into all the different multiple forms that we see all across the planet. It gets more obvious when you get down to things like the primate life forms, when you're looking at chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans and all that, and you can look at those and look at us and say, oh, yeah, well, I mean, we do have all these similarities that seem to say that we're all part of the same, basically, branch of the great tree of life. It's not quite so easy to realize that we all actually go all the way up to the slime molds and all the way down. So when people bring up the idea of irreducible complexity and just intelligent design to begin with, one of the things that it's important to understand is that intelligent design does not deny common descent. And that's important, because some people might say, well, the Bible might not, or science might not support creationism, and therefore the Bible is defeated. And somebody comes around and says, oh, but intelligent design, and then you think, oh, well, maybe the Bible has a way out. But it really doesn't, because even the most stalwart proponents of intelligent design, such as Michael Behe himself, who was, I think, the first person to really formulate intelligent design into a scientific theory, or hypothesis at least, he acknowledges common descent. He doesn't try to deny that humanity and the other primates are all part of the same genetic lineage going up to a primeval common ancestor. So it's important to understand what's being addressed by Herschel Walker, and what it is I'm trying to argue about in the first place. Because if you look back and you say, well, evolution still can't explain where life begins or how life begins. How did we get these little bitty organisms that are irreducibly complex, or these other evolutionary systems that are irreducibly complex? Yeah, I understand that. I mean, evolution doesn't necessarily have all the answers or claim to have all the answers, but there are questions that it has satisfied, and those questions are things that even intelligent design proponents who believe in irreducible complexity, and they believe in the probability arguments that I mentioned in the last video, even they accept those. So you can't use intelligent design, for example, to save the Bible. because the Bible's argument is that God, through a special creation of man, created the initial human ancestors, and that all human beings are descended from those ancestors. You don't get that from evolution. Moreover, and more importantly, and this is really the main conflict between the Bible and science, where it matters, right down to where it matters, is the notion of death, the notion of human death, and why death happens to humans. You got to understand what the Bible's authors were trying to accomplish when they first wrote the books, or that those stories in Genesis. What are those stories intended to prove? Because these are human origin stories. These are the how did the world get to be the way that it was stories. And when you look at the arguments that the Bible makes, you realize that the stories have to be written almost in exactly the way they are written in order for there to be a sort of coherence. And one of the ways in which the Bible's creation stories are written is to say that God created everything exactly as he wanted it to be. There was no trial and error involved in creation. There was no repeated iterations of suffering and death and suffering and death and more death and more death and more death, until finally, at the end product of all this iterative process of suffering and death, God came out with the animals and the humans and all the other life forms that he wanted to have. Now, that's what science would basically tell you. If science were trying to create a narrative of the creation of the world today, you would not see what you see in Genesis. You would not see God speaking the universe into existence, creating these environments whole cloth, creating all the species to populate these environments whole cloth, and then, dealing with humans on this individual basis in this not perfect world, but very good world, in which there was nothing for humanity to complain about. There was no state of deprivation. There was no state of suffering. There was nothing wrong with this world that you could lay at God's feet and say, God, why did you do this to us? How could you create this miserable world that we're living in? No. The Bible specifically sets up a story in which man is created into an environment that is not perfect, but near perfect. There's always room for improvement, because otherwise man would have nothing to do. But insofar as man had nothing to complain about, it was a perfect world. And then man screwed up. Man disobeyed God. And the conditions that we live under today, the conditions of privation and suffering, are the result of that primeval screw-up on man's part, when man decided to say, you know what, instead of accepting God's standard of good and evil, I'm going to create my own standard of good and evil, and I'm going to live by that instead. And that is how, in the Bible's terms, suffering and death enters the world for humanity. That's totally different from the evolutionary perspective, in which suffering and death is part of the process by which human beings come to be in the first place. You have these initial primate species that evolve and evolve and evolve and evolve and branch and branch and branch, until finally you have the primate species that we have today, including mankind. And it took all of these iterations of suffering and death to get us here. So these are two completely diametrically opposed paradigms. One in which, through a process of trial and error, you had all of this suffering and death eventually culminating in humanity, and then the Bible story of poof, man is there. So you have to understand that no matter how science can answer, whether or not science can answer the questions of how did life begin, that's really irrelevant to whether or not the Bible is accurate with regard to science as we know it today. Because once you've accepted common descent, once you've accepted that man didn't just spring forth from the mind of God, but got here through this long-standing trial and error process over eons and eons, involving suffering and death that eventually improved on the species to the point that we're here now in the shape that we're in. Uh, you don't there's no connection between the two, and there can't be a connection between the two, because the real moral philosophical undertaking of those first few stories of Genesis is really to absolve God of any blame for how the world is. And that's why it posits this creation in which everything is good, everything is very good, that man doesn't experience any suffering or death until the moment that he disobeys God. Because if you otherwise, your only other option, which is the option that science describes, is to have a world in which God baked suffering and death into creation from the beginning, and that this was not just part of man's experience, but part of man's origin from the beginning. And you can't have it both ways. So don't look to intelligent design, which accepts common descent, which accepts this continual process of suffering and death as being part of man's creation. Don't look to intelligent design to save the Bible from its mistakes, because that's just not going to happen. It can't happen. That's not how the Bible's authors intended it to be. I'm Mike Partika. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you later.